Elden Ring's world is full of lethal life. But the real question isn't which monster looks the scariest, it's which ones genuinely change how the Tarnished move, survive, and make sense of the lands between. Measuring danger here means more than attack numbers. It's about lethality in practice, the area a creature controls, and the weight its existence gives to local myth and corruption. Those three factors determine whether a monster is an obstacle to be learned and avoided, or a force that reshapes regions and stories. Start with the widespread territorial predators. These are the animals and abominations that don't just appear in one arena. They dominate routes, ambush choke points, and force detours across entire provinces. Their threat comes from predictable violence, pack tactics, patrol patterns, environmental adaptation, combined with persistence. They respawn, breed, or are reinforced by nearby sources of power. Where they hold sway, trade grinds to a halt, settlements harden, and the Erd tree's rot finds new footholds through disrupted ecosystems and terrified survivors. Understanding how these predators control space is the first step in ranking Elden Ring's deadliest beings. Territorial predators shape the everyday danger of the lands between. They aren't the rare boss encounters that stop progress for an hour. They are the animals and low-tier abominations that control roads, choke points, and supply lines. Their threat is defined less by one-hit deadliness and more by constancy, numbers that gang up, predictable patrols that trap the unwary, and environmental tactics that turn simple travel into a series of calculated risks. When these predators dominate a region, the map itself changes. Merchants reroute, small hamlets arm up, and players alter their paths accordingly. Start with the most familiar class, packs. Wolves and hounds are everywhere in early zones like Limgrave and the Weeping Peninsula. Individually, they are not exceptional, but they operate on a group logic. Packs will harry a lone traveler, use coordinated charges to knock stamina bars down, and wedge opponents into terrain where rolling away or retreating becomes difficult. Mechanically, their danger is compounded by respawn and placement. Spawn points near roads and bridges mean repeated confrontations, and spawn clustering allows ambushes from multiple angles. In lore terms, packs enforce a kind of wilderness law. Any route not actively policed by men is implicitly claimed by predators. That governance shapes movement more effectively than any scripted boss encounter. Giant boars and other burly ungulates perform a similar territorial function through brute force. A single boar can charge through shields and knock small groups off paths. Herds create moving walls that make travel slow and hazardous. Because they are tied to specific grazing areas and lairs, these animals turn otherwise safe stretches into temporary strongholds. Traders and NPCs in nearby settlements will avoid those grazing grounds, and players learn to respect the signposts, trampled grass, broken carts, or clustered carcasses as practical warnings on the road. Then there are the cliff and sky predators, wyverns and lesser dragons. These aren't the endgame ancient dragon lords of legend, but they control wide swathes of land. In regions like Dragonbarrow and certain mountain passes, wyverns patrol ridgelines and soar between perches. Their attack profile, fast aerial dives and breath attacks, forces ground travel into tight corridors or long detours. Because they claim vertical space as well as horizontal territory, they can deny an entire route, not just a mile of road. A traveler who ignores a wyvern's presence risks falling into a gank, hit by a dive, staggered into a cliffside fall, and finished by smaller ground predators waiting below. Environmental specialization is a key part of how predators hold ground. Poisonous lairs, marsh ambush points, and scorched hunting grounds grant predators both cover and repeated advantage. In places blighted by scarlet rot, for example, fauna does not simply become poisonous on paper, their behavior adapts. Creatures that make their dens in rot-soaked marshes would incorporate the toxin into their tactics, dragging prey into the water, using the terrain to restrict movement, or retreating to rock pools to heal and regroup. The landscape becomes an extension of the predator's weaponry. Likewise, predators on rocky coasts use narrow ledges and overhangs to force fight locations where their knowledge of footing offsets a player's weapon advantage. Numbers and reinforcement are another multiplier. Predator populations are sustained by nearby food sources, spawn mechanics, and sometimes the influence of nearby power centers. A ruined chapel or a demi-platform teeming with lesser enemies will feed a steady stream of predators that patrol the approaches. In game terms, this shows up as overlapping spawn points and patrol routes. Clear one wolf pack and the next will be back after resting at a site of grace or after the player moves on. From a world-building perspective, this explains why entire regions feel alive and hostile. Predators are part of a self-reinforcing system that regenerates pressure on travelers. Behavioral predictability is critical, and it's what separates territorial predators from more exotic threats. Packs tend to use similar tactics: flank, isolate, and focus on stamina attrition. Boars charge fixed angles and are vulnerable to backstabs if baited correctly. Wyverns return to perches and telegraph dives with a brief wind-up that can be baited or avoided by timing. That predictability makes them learnable. Players and inhabitants can adapt, changing routes, setting traps, luring predators into choke points, or using ranged tools to thin numbers before crossing a defended causeway. This adaptation is also visible in settlement behavior. Watchtowers, fortified caravans, and posted hunters are all responses to repeatable predator patterns. The Erd tree's corruption complicates this predictability, but does not erase it. In regions where the Erd tree's influence warps flora and fauna, ordinary predators take on extraordinary attributes. Rot and other taints can increase aggression, extend hunting ranges, or imbue animals with poisonous or diseased attacks. A wolf in a blighted valley might be stronger, more persistent, or accompanied by smaller, maddened creatures that complicate fights. The corruption often acts as a booster. It does not fundamentally change how a pack hunts, but it raises the stakes, turning a routine encounter into a potentially fatal one if the environment is leveraged against the unwary. Territorial predators also carry local myth and social weight. A road that is said to be ridden by the black hounds will be avoided by traders and pilgrim alike. Those stories become practical navigation tools. That cultural imprint matters for ranking danger because it means predators do more than kill. They shape economies, settlement patterns, and even the strategic value of a region. Governors and minor lords must account for predator pressure when choosing where to build roads or establish outposts. Those choices then alter the map for every tarnished that arrives later. The bottom line: territorial predators are ubiquitous and dangerous because they enforce movement and survival over wide areas. Their methods are straightforward: numbers, territory, environmental advantage, but effective. They turn open landscapes into managed spaces where travel costs resources and risks. Crucially, their danger is often tractable. Patterns can be learned, counters prepared, and routes adapted. That predictability is what separates them from the next class of threats, the uncanny, corrupted entities whose attacks and very existence break routine expectations. In other words, these predators define the normal, everyday hazard of the lands between. What follows are the things that redefine what danger even means. That predictability is what separates ordinary predators from the next class of danger, creatures whose very nature breaks the rules of the lands between. These are not simply tougher wolves or larger wyverns. They are corrupted, occult, or outright unnatural, entities shaped by the abyss, by reckless divine meddling, or by the poisonous currents that leak from the Erd tree and the frenzied flame. Their threat isn't just the damage they deal, it is the way they remake combat, territory, and even the meaning of life and death in a region. Start with origin. The uncanny enemies fall into a few overlapping sources. First is the abyss, a consuming otherness that warps flesh and mind. Creatures touched by the abyss gain properties that ignore ordinary rules. They bleed void-like shadows instead of blood, phase in and out of visibility, spawn tendrils of anti-life, or exert an influence that pulls at the soul. Astal, the natural born of the void, is an extreme example, an alien presence whose attacks and presence feel cosmic, bending space and teleporting in ways that standard melee strategies cannot reliably counter. The abyss turns the battlefield into a hazard not just of bodies, but of being. Surviving a strike is no guarantee if the strike erodes a character's very essence. A second source is the Erd Tree's corruption and the rot it spawns. Scarlet rot and related blights create zone-based hazards that make ground itself a weapon. Bosses like Scarlet Aeonia function less like opponents you kill than like ecosystems you must survive, spawning rot clouds, seeding pools, and forcing players to manage time and space in addition to health. Regions such as Caelid are examples writ large, a landscape where the rot altered settlement patterns, made agriculture impossible, and turned travel into a sequence of triage decisions. Enemies in these areas are adapted to the rot and to each other. They shrug off status effects that would cripple a normal foe and use the environment to win attrition battles. Third are the deliberate experiments of gods and demigods, grafting, deforming, and fusing lives to serve a purpose. This is both literal and ideological in Elden Ring. Grafted creatures, warriors or animals with multiple limbs stitched or fused together, display unpredictable attack patterns because their anatomy violates combat norms. The grafted scion is a canonical example, a being assembled to be a living weapon, throwing off conventional parry windows and stamina patterns. Godly experiments don't merely make stronger enemies, they create forms whose hurt boxes, priorities, and resistances demand new tactics. You can learn a swordsman's rhythm. You cannot always learn a thing that was built to be something else entirely. Fourth is cult and flame. The frenzied flame and similar cultish forces produce nightmares in the social and biological sense. Fervor and madness change behavior as much as bodies. Rituals can summon phantasmal guardians, bind mortals into monstrous servitors, or warp perception so that the player fights illusions as often as flesh. The consequence is enemies that operate by contagion, infecting groups with panic, pulling players towards self-destructive choices, or forcing a fight on terms set by religion rather than skill. Mechanically, these origins manifest in a short list of design patterns that make the horrors qualitatively different hazards. Area corruption. Many uncanny enemies weaponize space. Scarlet rot pools, void fields, and rune-laced zones deal ongoing harm, undermine healing windows, and force relocation. These areas force encounters to be fought on two fronts, the enemy and the environment. A single well-placed AoE or a lingering status cloud can turn a manageable duel into a death sentence for an unprepared Tarnished. Reality warping attacks. Teleportation, gravity distortion, temporal stuns, or attacks that ignore posture and stagger shift how fights play out. When an enemy can teleport behind you, inflict damage through shields, or ignore a guard entirely, standard responses, circle, bait, punish, become unreliable. Astal's light-falling stars and void beams are an extreme case, but smaller enemies adopt similar tricks in lesser degrees, disappearing and reappearing, summoning hurtful illusions, or gluing players to the ground. Resistance and immunities. Corrupted beings often resist the tools players rely on. Heavy poise, high-status resistances to bleed or rot, and regeneration tied to their environment mean that the usual arsenal, bleed builds, status stacking, crowd control spells, can fail. That forces players to adapt or to find rare resources and specific talismans to even the odds. It also reinforces the law. Corruption is resilient. It adapts like a disease, requiring targeted remedies rather than brute force. Summoning and life cycle tactics. Many eldritch foes are not solitary. They spawn minions, spawn hazards that operate on timers, or have phases in which they die outwardly and morph into something else. These life cycle mechanics turn a fight into a small war. The enemy you face at the start is often a harbinger. Kill it, and something worse is likely to take its place, or its death throws out a wave that reorganizes the battlefield. Illustrative examples from the lands between make the effect plain. In Caelid, roaming corrupted beasts and putrid vegetation combine to make paths treacherous. A cartographer's map is worthless when the ground beneath you actively corrodes your supplies and health. The Scarlet Aeonia encounter shows how a single living plant can weaponize rot on a scale that controls space and time in combat. Astal demonstrates how an otherworldly presence reframes physical laws and forces conventional combat into something fragile and contingent. The law consequences are as significant as the mechanical ones. Where predators regulate movement and territorial control, abyssal and eldritch horrors rewrite the terms of habitation. Villages collapse not because wolves ate the livestock, but because crops fail in poisoned soil, children are taken by void corruption, or whole communities are driven mad by rituals that invite the frenzied flame. These threats change political choices. Lords may abandon a fort because the surrounding land erodes the will of their people, or demigods might redirect military resources to quarantine areas where corruption is spreading. In short, uncanny creatures scale danger from personal threat to societal crisis. Finally, their unpredictability elevates danger into an existential category. A wolf can be outrun, a wyvern outmaneuvered. An eldritch horror can make the world itself a weapon. Facing these enemies is not merely a test of skill, but a test of contingency planning, resource management, status cures, specialized gear, and knowledge. The player who understands rot timers, the signs of abyssal taint, and the ritual origins of certain monstrosities gains a strategic edge. But even that knowledge only limits risk, it rarely eliminates it. These horrors therefore serve two functions in the ranking of danger. They are immediate threats that punish hubris and unpreparedness, and they are vector forces. They spread decay, demand new social responses, and sometimes rewrite the geography of danger itself. That is why, after accounting for ubiquitous territorial predators, the uncanny and corrupted entities deserve a separate category. They do not just kill, they redefine what it means to survive, preparing the stage for the final tier of threat, the apex beings and titans whose existence reshapes whole regions and narrative outcomes. Those uncanny horrors reframe danger into a matter of survival strategy. Apex beings do something else. They remake the rules altogether. They are rare, enormous, and often tied to the highest stakes in Elden Ring's mythos. The shards of power, the territorial claims of kingdoms, and events that alter whole regions. Measuring danger at this level means looking beyond hits per second or pack tactics and asking, how does a single being change politics, geography, and the player's path through the game? Three archetypes dominate this tier: ancient dragons, colossal titans, and demigod champions. Each operates at a different scale of threat and influence, but they share three defining traits. First, sheer physical dominance. They occupy and control vast swathes of land. Second, narrative weight. They are nodes in the story, holding keys, curses, or artifacts tied to the Elden Ring's broken order. Third, system impact. Defeating, or failing to defeat, them typically changes the map, the flow of NPC stories, and what options the player has going forward. Ancient dragons are the elemental rulers of the sky and high places. They're not just hard foes because they have massive health or devastating breath attacks. Their presence enforces a type of territorial control that reshapes travel and economy. A dragon perched over a valley can turn trade routes into death traps, force settlements to abandon farms, and keep enemy armies bottled up. In gameplay terms, dragons demand different solutions: airborne encounters, careful stamina management, and often environmental awareness so that a single tail sweep or dive bomb doesn't ruin a run. In lore terms, dragons are old powers predating many human and demigod dynasties. Their continued existence is a reminder that the lands between contains forces no one sovereign can fully command. Because of that, dragons function as both environmental hazard and as milestones. Removing one often opens new corridors or ends a climate of fear that has constrained other actors. Colossal titans are the ground's answer to that skyborne dominance. Giants, walking citadels, and animated constructs carve roads by their passage and change terrain with a single stomp. Unlike predictable predators, titans bring battlefield-scale effects, collapsing fortifications, creating chasms, and crushing entire groups in one swing. Their fights are often multi-phase encounters that combine environmental puzzles with raw brawn. You need to use cover, terrain, and timing rather than just trading blows. Because titans tend to be tied to places of labor or worship, their activation or defeat can abruptly alter industry and settlement patterns. A titan guarding a pass can make an allied kingdom invulnerable. One toppled or released can devastate farmland or reroute migration. In the player's progression, that manifests as new routes, ruined keeps, or previously inaccessible sites suddenly exposed. Demigod champions are the most consequential subset. These are named, willful beings who claim shards of the Elden Ring or hold sway over critical resources. Powerful demigods such as imposing warlords and corrupted heirs. Their importance is double. They're mechanically formidable opponents with unique abilities and phases, and they're political centers whose presence shapes entire realms. A demigod's court commands armies. Their cruelty or protection dictates where refugees go, which minor lords swear fealty, and which rituals persist. Crucially, many possess great runes or artifacts that are prerequisites for advancing the main arc. That makes confronting them not just a matter of optional difficulty, but a structural gate in the narrative. Look at how the world reacts to a demigod's influence. A territory under a demigod becomes oriented around sustaining their power. Supply lines, shrine networks, and even local cults conform to keep them strong. Conversely, when one falls, the results are immediate and uneven. Some areas stabilize, while others collapse into power vacuums. The fall of a demigod in the field might open access to a great rune, change enemy spawns, trigger NPC questlines, and reveal new dungeons. In several cases, the death of an apex being sets off emergent consequences that weren't just combat rewards. Entire events, new factions, or altered ecosystems follow. From a design and player experience perspective, Apex encounters force different preparations. Territory-scale threats penalize ignorance and reward reconnaissance. They promote specific builds, consumable management, and social solutions. Bringing in NPC summons, seizing siege engines, using elemental resistances, or finding high ground for ranged tactics. They also reframe risk-reward. Fighting an Apex being is rarely about loot alone. It's about timing. Engage too early, and you lose resources you'll need later. Delay too long, and a creature's influence might harden further or spawn new hazards. For example, some titans or demigods produce area effects, rot, blood corruption, gravitational anomalies, that progressively worsen, pressuring players into making decisions about when, where, and how to fight. Apex beings also amplify the thematic stakes of Elden Ring. They embody the corruption, ambition, or ancient power that underlies the shattering. An ancient dragon may be a vestige of the old order that refuses to bow to the new rulership. A titan might be animated by a failed god-forging ritual, its path of destruction literally cutting through the social order. A demigod is the political face of the Great Rune's fragmentation. Their struggles and rivalries are the battlefield where law and power intersect. Because these beings are tied to the highest order artifacts and stories, they function narratively as the points where a player's personal progression meets the world's history. The practical result is simple. Encounters with Apex beings change everything. Paths open or close, NPC relationships rearrange, and the very ecology of an area shifts. These fights are checkpoints that test not just combat skill, but planning, resource allocation, and understanding of how the lands between is woven together. They are few in number, but each carries outsized consequences, geographically, politically, and mechanically. So while predators and eldritch horrors define how you survive day to day and force you to adapt tactics, apex beings define the arcs of the world. Taking down a dragon, toppling a titan, or outmaneuvering a demigod doesn't just grant a prize, it redraws the map and reorders power. That is why they sit at the top of our danger ranking. Not because they are harder by raw numbers alone, but because a single encounter with an apex being can rewrite the rules of play and the history of the lands between. Our ranking isn't just a scoreboard of difficulty, it's a map of how danger organizes the lands between. Common predators enforce the rules of survival, shaping routes, supplies, and the everyday tactics players learn. Eldritch horrors fracture reality and force new strategies, encounters that change perception as much as hit points. Apex beings do more than test skill. They rearrange geography, politics, and story, turning single battles into turning points for the world itself. So the true measure of danger in Elden Ring is layered. Local threats teach you to survive, cosmic terrors unsettle what you know, and apex foes rewrite the map. Understanding these creatures is understanding the world, because every encounter encodes a tale of power, decay, and ambition that built the lands between.